Good afternoon to those of you who are on the East Coast. Good morning, those of you on the West Coast and in Alaska. So happy to have you here. My name is James Diamond, and I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs of the National Tribal Trial College. I'll be presenting today's webinar along with Hallie Bonger-White, the Director of the National Tribal Trial College. And we'll get started in a moment. I see so many friends and former students of ours and law enforcement officers from across Indian country, across the country. Welcome and thanks for joining us. This is the third in our series of webinars for law enforcement dealing with either domestic violence or sexual violence. Today's topic is crime scene management for tribal law enforcement in sexual violence cases. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll introduce Hallie, who many of you know. So I'm James Diamond, and I am the Dean of Academic Affairs for National Tribal Trial College. I was a state prosecutor for many years, prosecuting sexual violence cases. I was an assistant to the Attorney General of New York for some time, so about a decade of law enforcement experience. And then practiced criminal defense, defending, in fact, sexual violence cases for many years. Got a doctoral degree in Indian law, was a tribal prosecutor for a period of time, and director of the Tribal Justice Clinic at the University of Arizona. And today I am with the NTTC and also an adjunct professor of law teaching Indian law at Roger Williams University Law School. So glad to be here with you. And let me introduce to you my friend and the expert in this field, Hallie Bonger-White.
Good morning, good afternoon from beautiful Tucson, Arizona, and today is a very special day because it rained and we've been in a drought, and us desert dwellers, holy smokes, without rain we'd be nothing. So we need the rain. We've been praying for the rain, and this morning I woke up and it rained. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm an attorney, and I'm the director of the Southwest Center for Law and Policy, which is funded by US DOJ to be the sponsors of the National Tribal Trial College. That's who's bringing this webinar to you today. And also we have SafeStar, which is to collect sexual assault forensic evidence for tribal communities when you don't have access to a sexual assault nurse examiner. And we're also the National Indian Country Clearinghouse on sexual assault. I've been a trial lawyer in tribal, state, and federal courts, and I hope that all of you and your relatives and friends will consider applying for the National Tribal Trial College 2021 course so that you too can become a tribal court litigator and practitioner. I'm non-Indian, but I'm a mama and a grandma of a whole bunch of citizen Potawatomi Nation citizens out of Shawnee, Oklahoma. So a shout out to all the CPNs out there and all of you three fires out there. My special greetings to you all.
Thank you so much, Hallie. Let's get started. The topic is crime scene management for law enforcement. And, you know, your job in law enforcement is, you know, to build cases. But remember the end goal here. The goal is to build successful cases and to help your prosecutors get justice for victims. And think of me as a prosecutor, that you're going to be investigating a crime of sexual violence and turning it over to a prosecutor for prosecution. So you're building a case and a case for successful prosecution. Hallie?
So this is on crime scene investigation, and we use the word crime. So what you're going to be doing at the crime scene is going to help you with the criminal prosecution. Now, criminal prosecution is very important. I like to see justice for victims and communities. I like to see that justice advanced and have the perpetrators be held accountable. We all do. But I'm also a realist, and I know that that doesn't always happen. The bad guys don't always get caught, and they don't always get prosecuted. But what you do on the crime scene, the investigation that you do on the crime scene, not only does it advance your criminal investigation and prosecution, but there's a bunch of civil things that you can do where you can get your hooks into the bad guy and get some consequences to him even if you don't get a criminal prosecution, meaning even if the feds don't pick up the case, even if you're an Appeal 280 state, the state doesn't pick up the case, right? You can still get a protection order against the defendant. This kind of information that you're gathering and evidence you're gathering, it can help you in a lot of different cases. If there's a child custody issue and the perpetrator is an ex-boyfriend or ex-husband, boy, that goes a long way to help the judge decide that it's the victim, it's the mama who gets to have custody of those children. So just think broadly. It's not just investigating the crime scene for the crime at hand, but all that evidence that you get can help in a whole variety of other different types of cases.
Okay. All crimes have what we call elements. So your investigation has to be designed in a way to be proving elements. And sexual violence crimes, like all crimes, have these elements. Elements are the building blocks of the crime. Crimes have separate parts. And so you're doing your investigation, you're gathering evidence because the evidence tends to prove elements. And your police reports are going to establish the evidence that you've collected in a way that does actually prove elements. Evidence, we know, has many components to it, but I want you to think of elements like building blocks. Right? So a crime has its components, its elements, and it's a phrase that we borrow from science, right? Water is composed of the elements of hydrogen and oxygen. So crimes have elements too. I'll just give you a quick example that is very easy to understand, like a burglary, for example, it's not a sex crime, but it's a crime. A burglary has elements. That you are going to get evidence to prove elements. The elements of a burglary happens to be a person who breaks into or enters a building, right, number one, with the intent to commit a crime inside. Two elements, basically. And so you build your crime by gathering evidence, building elements one on top of another. Sexual offenses have elements as well. But you need all of the elements. You need all of the building blocks to build that wall. And so let's talk about sexual violence and the elements of sexual violence. Sexual assault is defined as when a person has sexual contact, that's element number one, with another person without their consent. That's the second element, okay? And now, sexual assault, sex crimes in Indian country or anywhere else have to establish those elements. Now, they're going to be, the definitions are going to differ a little bit depending on the jurisdiction, whether you are prosecuting that in one tribe or another, or you happen to be working with state court, depending on the kind of offender that you have, or federal court. You're going to have some differences, but this is the basic difference. Now, the kind of contact that you have and the kind of victim that you have may make the case more serious. So if it's contact with a private part, it's going to be one kind of sexual assault. If it happens to be sexual intercourse, it's more serious, right? If you have a compromised victim, a victim who is either young or old, it also makes it more serious. Remember, consent is such that it might be a sexual assault because the person is unable to consent, but it is sexual contact with a person without their consent. Those are the elements. That's what you're trying to prove by gathering up evidence. Again, your report and the evidence should be such that it is proving those elements, and the elements have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Each element has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Again, sexual violence, sexual contact without consent. Hallie?
So I'm going to do a big push for you to call a victim advocate to the scene as soon as you get called out to the scene. Everyone knows I'd be loving on some victim advocates because not only are they wonderful people who work hard for your communities, but they will help you to make your case. They will help you to find evidence that you normally wouldn't have located or wouldn't even known about. They'll help you with the victim. They'll make sure that the victim understands what the proceedings are. It is really hard. Any of you who've been called out to a scene of a crime of sexual violence and you've had to speak to a victim who's just been raped, it's very, very challenging. And I'm a woman, right? If you're a male, there might be another dynamic. If you're a non-native male and you're being called out to the scene, or it's an indigenous woman who's been sexually assaulted, there's all kinds of dynamics. There's all kinds of things that are going on. Having the victim advocate at the scene is going to make everything go more smoothly. You're also hooking up the victim right away with all the services that she needs to advance on her healing journey. So these are some of the things that the victim can help you with. Emotional support, I kind of touched on that a little bit. And it's an important thing. When you've been sexually assaulted, how systems respond to you can either help you on your healing journey or they can set you way, way back. And you could be dealing with this for decades with you and your children. So if you come to your job and to all the victims that are put on your path with the idea that you're there to help them, you're there to help your community, right? And so we want to provide all of the resources, all of the support that we possibly can, and calling a victim advocate that you've had a relationship with, that you've met before, to the scene is going to help you keep the victim in a good headspace so that she maybe has more likelihood of cooperating with the investigation and providing you with her health records, screenshots of text messages. Your victim advocate can help the victim with victim compensation. Maybe she needs to go into a shelter. There's lots of things that the victim advocate can do. Next slide, please. So I want to make it crystal clear here. There's a lot of different names for it. Sometimes we call them victim witness, sometimes we call them victim advocate, and we mix these terms up. If you've got a victim advocate type person, right, and they work for the police department, or they work for your prosecutor's department, they do not have confidentiality with the victim. If you've got a victim advocate, victim witness, whatever you call them, and you call them to the scene, anything that the victim tells that person, who may or may not be called a victim advocate, is admissible in court. The defense attorneys, and I'll confess, I was a public defender. Man, we were sneaky on this. We'd make you give it up. We'd call that victim witness and try to get statements that the victim had said. So just know that not everybody plays nice out there, and you could have some sneaky defense attorneys, so be careful about that. If you have a victim advocate who's from a freestanding program, so they work for the shelter, they work for their own victim advocacy agency, then it's very likely that they do have a confidential relationship. The victim, even at the crime scene, can let it all loose with that victim advocate, and that won't be admissible in court. Next slide.
And I, too, was a sneaky defense attorney at one point, Hallie. We're going to talk about crime scenes now. Hallie, you're up.
Okay, so when we think about crime scene, we think about the bedroom, the back of the car, you know, in the gymnasium locker room, right? Those are the crime scenes. That's not the primary crime scene. That's the secondary crime scene. So I want to kind of like refocus your minds on this, get your heads around this. The primary crime scene is actually the victim, right? Blow your minds a little bit. The primary crime scene in a sexual assault crime is going to be the victim. So something happened to her. She was touched in a way that was non-consensual, a sexual touching that was non-consensual, okay? What she says, physical evidence that you might find on her or lack of physical evidence that you find on her, right, on her body, on herself, that's the primary crime scene. So I want you to treat the victim both as a beautiful human being and part of Creator's creation who's had a horrific thing happen to her, and also be conscious when you're interacting with her that she may have evidence on her, in her, right, and treat her respectfully, lovingly, professionally as a primary crime scene in these types of crimes. Next slide.
So the secondary crime scene is the physical environment where the crime took place. And I want to talk for a little bit about securing the crime scene. Securing the crime scene is critical because what you want to do, what you need to do, is to maintain the integrity of the evidence. When we say maintain the integrity of the evidence, we mean to secure it and to protect it. And we're going to be going to court and establishing that, in fact, it came from the secondary crime scene, it came from the primary crime scene, it came from the crime scene, and it hasn't been tampered with, it hasn't been contaminated, it hasn't been changed, it hasn't been replaced. And so we have to secure the crime scene. We do that in a number of ways, and we have to protect and to establish what we call the chain of custody of evidence. Chain of custody is it's a term that we use in all criminal cases, but certainly sexual violence cases, sexual assaults. Chain of custody is a term that refers to how you document who had possession of an item, of physical evidence, from the time it was collected at the crime scene to the time it's presented in court. And we have to, in fact, identify that and document that through your investigation. We want as few as people as possible to come in contact with physical evidence. We want to try to limit that as best as we can, because we have to put every one of these witnesses who came in contact with the evidence in court. We have to present them because the evidence is not going to be admitted. The physical item is not going to be, or the results of a scientific test, is not going to be admitted in the sexual assault case unless you can establish that this chain was unbroken and that the item has integrity. So that's what we mean when we talk about chain of custody. We're talking about continuity of possession, okay? And every person who came in contact with this physical item or the scientific item, right, that was examined has to be accounted for. And so what we do is, what you do, is to place the evidence in a proper container, to mark the container properly, to make sure you're using proper seals so that evidence doesn't get contaminated, ruined, or lost. And you're documenting that chain of possession, okay, with documentation, with an evidence log that I'm suggesting that you use, and then you are storing the evidence in a way that protects it as well. So, because it may be quite some time from when the evidence is collected until the time it's used in court. Could be years, right? So you want to make sure the continuity is logged. You want to make sure it's accounted for. You want to make sure that everything is marked. You want to make sure it is sealed, stored properly, and that you have documentation. So I do suggest that you keep a chain of custody record. Your department should have forms for this, and if they don't, I suggest you establish those records. You're going to need to present this in court. Every person who received the item should be signing on a custody log, the date of receipt. If one person, as I said, best to kind of limit that. So, if you're the person who is the primary investigator in a case, if you have a choice for who's going to drive that item sealed and protected to a state lab or a federal lab for analysis, limit the number of people who have contact with it, and you should drive it up. Again, you should have you keep a log and have the proper sealed and proper storage as well. Okay, let's talk about the kinds of evidence we have in sexual assault cases. Kind of evidence. So remember a minute ago I talked about the building blocks, right? Establishing the elements, proving the elements of sexual assault. Sexual contact without consent. And we do that by gathering evidence, and all kinds of evidence. And evidence can be physical evidence that you collect at the crime scene, from either your primary crime scene or a secondary crime scene. Your evidence might be statements that you take from witnesses, from your victim, as Hallie has talked about, or the suspect. Or it might be diagrams, sketches, maps, could be photographs, videos, recordings, reports. They might be reports like medical reports of examination. They could be public records and reports. This is all evidence and evidence that you are in fact gathering. Well, let's break it down a little bit more and talk about physical evidence. Physical evidence in a sexual assault case can include just about anything, but here's some examples. Cigarette butts. People tend to discard these and leave them behind, and they're, if in fact they're really important because they may have scientific forensic evidence on them. Here's just some other examples: beer bottles, broken furniture, the bedding that was used in a sexual assault. Perhaps a weapon was used. Ligature is a fancy word for something that's used to tie up a sexual assault victim. Ropes or other things that might have been used to commit the crime. When you get to a crime scene, you don't know whether these items are going to have microscopic scientific traces that are left behind that a suspect leaves behind, or a victim attributed to a scene. And so we collect all of this so for examination, because you just don't know what's going to be on it because it's microscopic. Beer bottles a suspect may have left behind saliva on a glass or a beer bottle, or fingerprints. And furniture, something that's broken in the course of an offense, it might be evidence, in fact, of violence. Violence is evidence that the sexual contact or the sexual intercourse happened without consent, and so that's why it is in fact important. Okay, let's talk about managing the crime scene. So managing the crime scene is something that that you, as the investigating officer, have to take control of. A successful management of the crime scene makes for successful sexual assault cases. So it's critical to handle the crime scene and to do it properly. Okay, well, what do I mean when I say do it properly? Well, for one thing, you've got to control access to the crime scene. So we identify the boundaries of the crime scene. We mark it off with in some way, and crime scene tape is a good way to do it, like that tape in the slide there of the bedroom, the crime scene where the sexual assault took place. But we may also be marking off boundaries and restricting access to a building. Here's an example of that. Actually happens to be on an Indian reservation. And so you want to control access. You want to prevent people from coming onto the crime scene, right? Who might interfere with the crime scene, who might remove items from the crime scene, who might alter items on the crime scene, might steal items from the crime scene, and you want to so you need to set up this perimeter and have yourself or another officer prevent people from coming onto the crime scene who can alter it, who can somehow interfere with the integrity of the evidence. This might be members of the public. It might be newspaper or journalists, TV reporters who come on to the crime scene, and while the public has a right to to be there, they don't have a right to interfere with the evidence. And so you have to control access to the crime scene, and you need to document the way you did that, because tricky, sneaky defense lawyers, like Hallie and I used to be at one point or another. I've been on both sides, so I'm an unusual and rare bird in that I've been both a prosecutor and defense lawyer, and a state prosecutor and a tribal prosecutor, as well as being a defense attorney. So we know what happens. You want to be able to establish that, in fact, the crime scene was protected. So you have to document that. Identify the boundaries. What is the secondary crime scene, right? Where did you locate the evidence? You're going to be photographing it. You're going to be documenting it. Perhaps you're going to be diagramming it. We did a webinar last month on documenting the crime scene in your police reports with maps and sketches, and this is, in fact, the third in our series. But you're going to identify those boundaries, right? Here's a crime scene in Indian country, and you will use some natural barriers to mark off the crime scene. Again, there's police officers who are watching the crime scene and making sure nobody's interfering with it. Okay, but again, document how you did it. Again, you want to establish the integrity of the evidence, because you're not going to get the evidence submitted in court unless you can show that it has integrity. It wasn't altered with. It wasn't contaminated. It wasn't removed. It wasn't replaced, right? And so that's what you're doing by guarding the secondary crime scene. Now, if you have some evidence that is outdoors, maybe fragile, you want to cover it and protect it as well. Okay, I think. Excuse me. So you want to maintain a log that shows who came and went from the crime scene. Okay, every person who came and went from the crime scene, and this is a good example of a form to do that. Again, if your department doesn't have a crime scene entry log, make one up, get one, print one up, and bring it with you. And this tells you exactly who came and went. So when it comes time to testify and you're cross-examined about the crime scene and whether you maintained integrity to it, you can say exactly who came and went and what time they came and went from the crime scene. Okay, I want to talk about now, switch gears a little bit and talk about forensic evidence. Okay, forensic evidence is evidence that is scientific evidence that is used to prove a sexual assault and the identity of an offender, or disprove the identity of a of an offender. Excuse me. So forensic evidence, like I say, it's scientific evidence, and it may exist within body fluids like saliva, blood, semen. It may exist within hair. It may exist within fibers. It may exist within debris. And we are sending these items, collecting these items, preserving these items, and having these items examined for the presence of a biological trace elements. And so, but they may be really important to your sexual assault case and to proving your sexual assault elements beyond a reasonable doubt. And your forensic, so you're collecting this evidence, or you're having an evidence technician collect the evidence. Some of these items, interestingly enough, in criminal law, is that this is an interesting subject. The items that, like blood, for example, and DNA, which we'll talk about in a moment, is referred to as non-testimonial evidence. It's referred to, so we have testimony, right? Someone comes to court and testifies, and we have non-testimonial evidence. And so non-testimonial evidence, like blood and saliva and things like that, a person can't object to being taken from them. It's non-testimonial. Miranda versus Arizona doesn't apply. But let's get to this scientific evidence. The forensic evidence is really important in a sexual assault because it does, in fact, it can prove the elements of a crime. For example, it can prove that, in fact, there was perhaps sexual intercourse. It can identify the person who contributes to an item, leaves behind some biological material. It can also, it helps convict those who are guilty of an offense or innocent of an offense. It can clear someone. And scientific evidence is equally as important in convicting a sex offender as it is in clearing a person who's innocent. And none of us want people convicted of a sexual assault who's innocent, okay? And so the collection of the scientific evidence is critical in proving guilt or innocence of a suspect. It also helps you as a law enforcement officer to move your investigation to another area, perhaps. If you can establish that an offender had sexual intercourse with your victim, it may change the case from one where we're no longer proving that sexual contact occurred, because now it's clear it occurred, and now the case is being investigated for whether or not there was consent. Okay, but scientific evidence helps establish the elements of the crime, identify a contributor, and is critical toward establishing either guilt or innocence. Talk about a couple of different kinds of forensic evidence. We talk a lot about DNA, and DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. And DNA is a scientific term. It is contained within a person's body. both the offender and the victim, witnesses as well who may have come onto a crime scene are going to have DNA. It's in everyone's blood. It's in your skin. It's in your saliva. It's in semen. And it is unique to you. And so when we identify DNA at a crime scene, we can eliminate suspects, or we can point to a suspect, because once we find DNA, we have it tested. It is again, it is so persuasive when it is found. If a offender, a suspect, says, I was never at that crime scene. I was never in that bedroom, and yet we find blood or skin cells or hairs at the crime scene, or we find hair on the victim's clothing, right? And we have it analyzed, and it comes out not to be the victim's hair, it's someone else's hair, and it turns out that in the victim's clothing is hair, and it matches the DNA, the genetic match, almost nearly 100% as being contributed from a suspect. Well, now what's the suspect's explanation for how their DNA got on the, let's say, the panties of the victim, right? So now we've got a really critical evidence, and so it is absolutely fundamental. Again, the DNA may corroborate where the assault took place. If there was a struggle, we may find under the victim's fingernails, skin of a suspect that we identify through DNA. The different DNA that we find in the crime scene and at various items may show us the sequence of events. The DNA evidence may corroborate other testimony that we have, may show that what the victim is saying or other witnesses are saying is true or not true based on the DNA evidence. So when we say that DNA evidence can validate testimony, let's say your suspect says, I was held down and beaten, right? And we've got some bruising that shows that, right? But we've got some blood that shows that, right? So it tends to make that evidence appear, to be true. It validates it. It corroborates it. DNA evidence might also impeach testimony, and that means it tends to show that testimony is not truthful. Okay, the importance about DNA evidence: if you don't collect it at the scene, it can't be tested. So you've got to collect it, and not only do you have to collect it, but you have to collect it properly, and you have to maintain it properly, and you have to identify and document it properly, and you do that within the chain of custody type of approach that I talked about earlier. Again, if you don't collect it, it can't be tested. So that's why you've got to collect it and collect it all. And when we talk about how you're going to go about collecting it, let me turn it over to Hallie for a discussion of collecting it.
Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you is don't be afraid about collecting DNA, right? That sort of rhymes. I'm just going to put it right out there. I helped with the assistance of many tribal prosecutors to create the National Tribal Prosecutors Sexual Assault Protocol. Also, with the help of a whole bunch of incredibly smart tribal cops, created the National Tribal Law Enforcement Sexual Assault Protocol. And I can tell you that I could train you how to collect DNA. I could train your grandma how to collect DNA, and I could train your 22-year-old daughter with blue hair how to collect DNA. What we're doing is we're just making sure that we're not contaminating anything. So those of you who are old enough for the OJ trial where they said if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, right? So if you document the crime scene properly, there's not going to be any discussion about where you found that glove or did you plant that glove, right? Because you're going to have it, the crime scene is going to be marked off. You're going to show who had access to the crime scene, what went in, what went out, right? So you can collect DNA. It can help to convict people. In this day and age where we're all watching all these crime TV shows, it seems like DNA is everywhere, but I want to let you know, though, DNA may not be found in your case, and that doesn't mean that she wasn't sexually assaulted. In the vast majority of sexual assault crimes, they're unable to come up with DNA, okay? And that's not because she wasn't sexually assaulted. It's because maybe he was wearing a condom. Maybe it's out, you know, she disclosed her sexual assault 5 days after she was sexually assaulted. Maybe they're just, where they looked for it, there wasn't any semen or saliva and they weren't able to collect it, or maybe it deteriorated. So just the fact that there isn't DNA doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And then I'm old enough, I'll confess, that we used to prosecute cases without DNA. What we did, so revolutionary, we would hear the victim and she would say, I was sexually assaulted, this is how it happened, and then we would take all the circumstantial evidence, right? Was there an eyewitness? Was there security cameras? Was her clothes ripped? Did she have unexplained injuries? And we would prosecute those cases. So DNA is not the be-all and end-all. And then also in the age of coronavirus and contact tracing, that concept of you want to wash things, you want to wash your hands, right? Because you don't want to take the virus back home to you and your loved ones. The same thing with DNA. You can leave fingerprints, you can leave your DNA different places, and we want to be able to, quote unquote, contact trace to be able to pick that stuff up. For those of you who are in resource-poor communities, shout out to those of you in Alaska villages, you don't need to have necessarily the fancy evidence log. You could just print out like what we did, or take a yellow pad and make sure that you preserve that. You can use rope instead of crime scene tape. There's a lot of things that you can do on the fly, right? Paper bags are essential. Don't ever use plastic. These are the kinds of things that will degrade the evidence. So we're not going to go into detail about how to bag and tag, but just be sure that you document who's at the crime scene, what they're bringing in, what they're taking out, and you want to make it so that the sneaky defense attorneys can't argue that you're planting the bloody glove on the scene and trying to frame that poor defendant, right? Because you got a grudge against them. That's what we want to prevent. We don't want them to walk. We don't want all of your hard work to go for naught, right? So make sure that you have as many of these tools as possible. By light source, I mean like flashlight, right? Or if there's someplace where there's not electricity, and you can't just flip on the lights, but you want to have some kind of camera, some kind of recording device if at all possible, right? Paper bags to put things in. Next slide, please. So what do you do if you've got a victim who obviously has some kind of distress and they've got bloody clothes and bloody garments? You, as an officer on the scene, should not be making the victim disrobe unless it's an outer garment, right? So if she's got on a heavy parka and you believe that there might be some kind of evidence or DNA on the heavy parka, you can ask, that's polite, that's not going to traumatize her. You might be able to get that off of her, bag it and tag it. One of the suggestions I have, though, is that you put down some kind of a paper sheet, when you go to the doctor's office, they make you sit on that kind of paper kind of stuff. Well, you can get some kind of paper sheet like that or something and have her take off her jacket on top of that. Because sometimes there might be hair or something like that from the defendant that might fall off as she's trying to take off her bloody jacket. Have different sizes of paper bags, because if it's a jacket in winter wear or a blanket, something like that, that's going to be huge. It's not going to fit into a sandwich bag. But if you've got, let's say, a bloody pair of mittens or a bloody face mask, maybe in the age of COVID, you could put that in the smaller bag. Next slide, please. So when you come onto the crime scene, a lot of victims, after they've been sexually assaulted, they are in such trauma that they'll take off the clothes that they wore while they were being sexually assaulted, and they'll throw them on the floor, they'll put them in a laundry basket. They'll decide they never want to see that dress again. It has such bad memories, they'll throw it in the trash. So you want to ask the victim at the crime scene, what clothing she was wearing and where you might be able to locate those clothes. Again, don't pile the clothes one on top of each other. The sneaky defense attorneys are going to try to infer that any of this DNA evidence, any of this evidence that you pick up on the scene, that you have some kind of crazy vendetta against the defendant and you went and contaminated the crime scene, or you're totally inept. That's what they're going to try to do, and that's one of the ways that you can lose the case, which not only makes all of your hard work go away, but it also re-traumatizes the victim, re-traumatizes the entire community. So if you got clothing items, try to package them one at a time. We've got a picture here where it's laid out on top of a piece of paper or a drape, right? And that helps the crime lab make sure that you're not cross-contaminating things and makes it less likely that a defense attorney is going to attack the evidence. Next slide, please. Gloves. That's one of the hardest things I found is putting the gloves off and on, right? You want to get the correct size glove for your hand. I know that sounds really crazy, but if you've got big hands and you're trying to smash them into like a little glove, that's going to make it really, really hard for you. So make sure that you've got different size gloves and the one that's correct for you. If you've got your own kit, if you share materials with other officers, right, you want to make sure you get different sizes. Also, your agency or department should have protocols, rules, procedures about how to tag and tag things. If they want your initials, if they want your full name, how they want the date written, how they want the time written, right? What kind of evidence tape they want to use to seal it. Follow your agency's protocols. And if you don't have any, you can call me on the phone and I'll try to shoot you protocols from other tribal agencies that maybe are similarly situated so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Next slide, please. So some victims, a certain percentage of them, you might get to them within a window of time, maybe within 72 hours or 5 days after they've been sexually assaulted, and they may want to report the crime. They may want to have a sexual assault forensic evidence exam, also known as a SANE exam or a rape kit or a SAFE exam. That's called by a lot of different names, but a lot of people are not going to want that. Just because a victim doesn't want to have a sexual assault forensic examination doesn't mean that she wasn't sexually assaulted, doesn't mean that it never happened, doesn't mean that she's lying. It could be that she has had a lot of trauma or her family has had a lot of trauma, and going and being transported 4 hours away so that an Anglo woman can go and, as we say, look up her hoo-ha, right, after you've been sexually assaulted could be so traumatic that they don't want to have an exam. You don't force the victim to have an exam. You can offer the exam. Having a victim advocate at the scene or a victim witness at the scene will encourage more of your victims to go in and have that examination. Even if they do go in and have that examination, it's possible that they won't be able to collect any DNA, but they can collect all types of other evidence. Even if they're swabbing her and don't find the DNA, they can find other evidence that can help you in the investigation and prosecution. You want to make sure that you know what kind of a sexual assault collection kit that your SANE or your SAFE is using, and you want to have policies and procedures so you know where it is that you're going to have that be transported and where that's going to be stored and who's going to be testing it. And in different jurisdictions, it can be different. So some tribes have elected to have the state crime lab. Even if you're not Public Law 280, they've made a choice as sovereign nations that they want their kits tested by, say, Tohono Nation decided, state of Arizona, you can evaluate and test our kits, right? A lot of tribes are going to be going to Quantico, Virginia, and have their stuff shipped over there, so know where it's going to go. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the kinds of things that a sexual assault nurse examiner is going to be doing. She's going to be doing those buccal swabs, those giant Q-tips to try to find anally or vaginally or orally if there's any DNA, any semen, any saliva. She's going to be doing a general examination of the victim to see if there's any bruises, any cuts, any abrasions. Fingernails are ripped off, those kinds of things, clumps of hair ripped off. They're going to be collecting this type of evidence. Next slide, please. They're going to be using a body map as well, and they're going to be showing where the injuries are. Now, if you are at the scene and you see a victim, let's say she's wearing a tank top, right, and you can see that she got a fingernail ripped off that said number 1, right, in the diagram. You could also have a body map. You could also show on visible parts of her body where it is that you note injuries. Next slide, please. Before you photograph injuries of a victim at the crime scene, and this is what the SANE nurses do at the hospital, you need to obtain consent from the victim, and you need to maintain her dignity and her modesty. After someone's been sexually assaulted, right, if I told you that I was sexually assaulted and he bit my left breast and left teeth marks, you should not, at the crime scene, ask me to show you my left breast. That's something that's just, even if you're a female officer, not appropriate to do. You should ask her if she wants to go and meet with a sexual assault forensic evidence collection person or a SANE nurse and have them do it. When you're taking photographs, you want to have some kind of reference point that's either a ruler or a quarter or a dime, and you want to make sure that when you take the photos that you're storing them appropriately. We say have extra camera cards if you're using a camera, and don't ever delete any of the photos that you take. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of one of our safe stars who's photographing a victim. You see that she's getting up very, very close, and she's taking a photograph of the victim's injuries. Next slide, please. If you're able to, right, she has some kind of a bruise on her face. What do you think caused that? Was that a knife? Was that a fist, right? It looks like blunt force trauma to me. If you have enough training to be able to say whether it's a blunt force trauma or it looks like it's a cut or a stab, you can put that in your report along with the photograph. Next photo, please. So this is a photograph of somebody who was cut with a very sharp object. They had something very sharp hit them, right? So if you know what caused this, if you know it's a sharp injury, feel free to include that in your report. Next slide, please. Strangulation. Sometimes people say, he choked me out. This is really important for you to screen each and every victim, each and every crime scene, and ask did anyone put their hands on your neck? Did anyone choke you? Even though choking is like, I have a piece of food lodged in my throat, I'm choking, right? That's one thing versus someone else is using pressure on your neck. The reason why we want to know is because she can die within 24 hours. If she was strangled during the sexual assault, which is very, very common, and I hate to say especially in Indian country with Native victims, it's very, very common, you want to find out about it and you want to encourage her to go to the ER or to get checked out immediately because she can die from that. So you want to make sure you ask these questions. Next slide, please. Strangulation can result in petechiae. These are these little marks that would indicate that indeed she was strangled. Sometimes victims might be intoxicated or unconscious, not know they were strangled. If you see any of these signs, the little red dots in the eyes or in the mouth or on the skin, it's more likely or not that she's been strangled. Next slide, please. Also, the good thing about finding evidence of strangulation, which is bad for the victim, but good for the investigation because I like to charge that as attempted homicide. And then you get a harsher sentence against the defendant. If she's wearing any kind of a necklace, it can also lead to marks that you can photograph. Next slide, please. Bite marks. This is also hickeys, bite marks, these kinds of things. You can see in this photo that we've got rulers, so we can say when we get on the stand how many centimeters or how many centimeters tall or wide it was. Makes your testimony look good. We have a reference shot in the first picture that shows the victim's neck and then a close-up shot. You always want to start off with a picture of the victim to show that indeed it is the victim. So show her face and then show the part of the body, right, the neck, and then zoom into the actual injury itself. Next slide. You want to be careful when you have victims with dark skin. Some of their injuries might not show up as well as with some of the more lighter skinned victims, and they tend to ripen after a few days. So at the crime scene, you may see some bruises. You may want to come back in 72 hours to see when they ripen. Next slide, please. and abrasions. I think we're going to let's skip this one. We're running short on time and I want to be respectful to you, right? So abrasions, swelling, these kinds of things, you want to make sure that you preserve this in photographs. Jurors are visual people. A picture is worth 1,000 words. We tend to believe DNA and photos over a victim's own words, fortunately or unfortunately. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Hallie. We're almost out of time. I just want to, in the last couple of minutes, just to even, we know how important solving this case is, how important proving this case is, but you have to, as an officer, maintain your integrity and don't exaggerate because you want justice. Because if you exaggerate, the case might be lost. The evidence might be disqualified. So you need to always maintain honesty, integrity, and remember that there's also going to be a case tomorrow. And so as important as this case is, you may lose the whole case because you exaggerate. The consequences of dishonesty are quite severe. And you're going to have to testify in the case, and if you exaggerate or you haven't maintained the integrity of the crime scene or you haven't maintained the integrity of the items themselves, you're going to be cross-examined, and you're going to have to explain why you did or the discrepancies in your report. So be thorough, be honest, collect the evidence, put it in your reports, document it so that when you're cross-examined, it all holds up. Well, Hallie and I want to thank you for your attention this morning, this afternoon. There were some questions. Let me tell you, there's been a bunch of questions about jurisdiction. And jurisdiction in sexual assault cases in Indian country is the most complicated subject that exists. I'll be happy to answer questions privately or send you materials. I've actually got a recorded lecture about jurisdiction in Indian country. It's extremely complicated, whether that's about federal jurisdiction, state jurisdiction, tribal jurisdiction, PL 280 jurisdiction, extremely complicated. So I'll be happy to answer those questions and share my answers with you privately. But Hallie and I thank you for attending. We're very grateful that you attended. Listen, as Hallie said about strangulation, this very well could be lethal. And so your work in this field is so important, and we thank you for it. We're grateful for it. We want to help you with it, but you very well might be saving a life. So thank you, and do let us know if we can help you in any way. We've got another course coming up next month about agreements between police departments, law enforcement collaboration, and community policing. But for the National Tribal Trial College, I'm James Diamond, and this is my dear friend Hallie. We thank you for attending, and we'll see you next month. Hello?